In this compilation video, I invite you to revisit some of the videos featured on my channel last year, exploring cases of dark demonic possession, hauntings, and poltergeists. My name is Laura, and you are watching The Paranormal Scholar. The year was 1981, and Christopher Malcolm was at number 30 Thornton Road, located in Birmingham, England. For the past few weeks, his parents had been complaining of vandals lurking at the bottom of the garden, throwing rocks at the house at night. No one had ever been seen, let alone caught, and so the young man took it upon himself to stage a stakeout so as to catch the culprits. Strapping his father's old wartime tin hat to his head for protection, he concealed himself in the shadows and waited. He stayed outdoors for hours. At first there was nothing, just the quiet of the night, until all of a sudden he heard a loud crash, the sound of a stone smashing a window. Actioned alert, Christopher rushed to apprehend the vandal, only to find that there was no one there. Not only that, his parents' garden was some 150 feet in length, far too long for a wayward youth to have lobbed a rocky projectile from a concealed vantage point. Broken glass on the ground, it didn't make sense, especially when several of the Malcolm family's neighbours complained of the same. More rocks, more smashed windows, more sleepless nights. Indeed, the residents of Thornton Road so grew to fear the dark and its mysterious stone-throwing inhabitants that the police and even exorcists were called in. For, with no physical culprit to blame, whispers soon began to spread of a metaphysical miscreant, some manner of eerie unseen entity, a poltergeist, who watched from the shadows and was responsible for the stone-throwing siege that would ultimately grip this otherwise ordinary street for 6 long and terrifying years. My name is Laura, and you are watching The Paranormal Scholar. Speaking to the Birmingham Weekly Mercury newspaper in 1982, Christopher Malcolm's mother, Evelyn, described how she had lived at number 30 Thornton Road for 36 years. It was her beloved home, a home that was now under constant threat. After all, what had started as infrequent, isolated happenings had evolved to nightly occurrences. The raids had shattered every pane in a reinforced glass garage roof, causing hundreds of pounds worth of damage, resulting in her family feeling the need to erect a 6-foot-high fence around the garden and install wire mesh screens around the roof and over windows to catch the missiles. Undoubtedly, Mrs. Malcolm was stressed and losing sleep, worried about the rising cost of the damage and feeling as though somebody's watching all of the time, waiting to throw the next rock. Such was a feeling shared by others in the road, including Natalie Holford of number 32. Just 17 years old at the time, she explained in an interview many years later how her school studies suffered because of the stone-throwing activity. In her own words, you could hear the stones rolling down the roof. It was like being stalked, always happening when you were falling asleep. Sleep-deprived and scared, it felt as though Natalie's entire family was disintegrating, with her mother in particular at her wits' end because of the lack of sleep. Reviewing the basic details of the Thornton Road case, or as it is better remembered, the Birmingham poltergeist, it is perhaps easy to dismiss this as an instance of unsolved persistent vandalism. After all, to the untrained eye, there is arguably little that screams supernatural. And yet, in many ways, it is precisely this case's unsolved and persistent nature that makes it intriguing, for it speaks of a strange and subtle terror that leached into the everyday lives of the families of the 5 affected houses. Even early on, the residents were unnerved, with Christopher Malcolm, as has been described, attempting to take matters into his own hands so as to relieve the pressure on his aging parents by catching the stone throwers. In another of the houses, number 36, brother and sister Geoffrey Sidebotham and Gwyneth Donnelly were similarly forced to watch their parents suffer. The happenings were, so Geoffrey has claimed, an absolute nightmare. Windows were smashed every night. As soon as one was replaced, it would be put through again. Although he worked nights and was therefore not present when the windows were smashed, he had a front row seat to the impact the activity had on his family, in particular on his ailing mother, who was crippled with arthritis and emphysema. She died in the midst of the happenings in 1982, with both Jeffrey and Gwyneth believing that the unceasing nightly sieges hastened her death. "It took my mother's life," Gwyneth poignantly expressed in a later interview with the Birmingham Mail. Their beds were often found covered in glass, and on one chilling occasion, a stone is even said to have come through a window right next to Jeffrey and Gwyneth's mother, landing with force by her wheelchair. At number 30, Evelyn's husband also died in the midst of the activity, both tragically passing without ever discovering the cause of their daily terror. And this was by no means because no cause was sought. In addition to residents staking out their own back gardens in an attempt to solve the mystery of the stones, they also contacted the police. Discussing his involvement in the case for a 1985 episode of Arthur C. Clarke's World of Strange Powers, Chief Inspector Len Turley explained how he thought he would put 2 policemen on it and it would be finished in a couple of days. In reality, his police force spent a total of 3,500 man-hours in observations and inquiries in the Thornton Road area, all without result. Hundreds of people were questioned, tracker dogs were brought in, ballistic experts were consulted, and teams of police officers were stationed in and around the affected houses, lying, standing, hiding themselves from 6 p.m. in the evening until 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning in all kinds of weather, even going on tops of roofs of adjoining properties and installing infrared cameras inside the houses in an attempt to catch whoever was responsible. No one was ever seen, even as the rocks mysteriously rained down around the police officers, shattering roof tiles, ripping gutters loose, and breaking windows. It was, in short, virtually a battleground. Despite claims of police incompetence, with some, including Jeffrey Sidebotham, lamenting some 30 years later how someone and not something got away with a crime, the police both at the time and since have defended their involvement in the Thornton Road case. For indeed, in the course of their inquiry, they were able to record and solve 5 murders, 2 of which were said to have been extremely complicated. Vandalism should surely have been child's play by comparison. And yet, there was nothing that could be done to solve it. Even when the police were able to provide illumination upon some of the case's stranger, finer details, such as how their forensic expert proved all of the rocks were free of dirt, having been meticulously washed or scrubbed before being launched at the houses, there was little that could be done to find a resolution. In the end, they were forced to abandon their inquiry, stating, somewhat ridiculously, that their only theory was that vandals could have been using a high-powered catapult so as to launch the rocks at the houses from a distance. At this point in the case, some 2 years into the inexplicable activity, the residents of Thornton Road were desperate and terrified. Gwyneth Donnelly has spoken of how she used to go to bed with a Bible under her pillow, praying every night for it to stop. 2 doors down, a young Natalie Holford lay awake in the dark, waiting for something to happen. Whoever or whatever was throwing rocks at the houses always waited for night to fall, with much of the activity said to have taken place in the small hours, between 3 and 4 a.m., the notorious witching or devil's hour. One notably eerie incident is said to have happened to a housewife at another of the houses, just after dark, when she went out into the garden to retrieve a pair of trousers from the washing line. All of a sudden, she is said to have been rushed by an overpowering sensation that she was being watched from the shadows. Grabbing the clothing, she hurried indoors. Just as she crossed the threshold of her home, a stone is said to have been thrown in her direction, hitting the wall. In her mind and the minds of others, the attack was targeted. She had been watched, and whoever had been doing the watching wanted to scare her. Evelyn Malcolm expressed something similar when she recalled how rocks would be launched at her house whenever she went to draw the curtains for the night, the attacker waiting for her to appear at the window before striking. Ultimately, some of the residents' fears grew to such proportions that they invited churchmen into their homes in a desperate attempt to exorcise the seemingly otherworldly activity. Natalie Holford's family was one of the houses. It is not known whether this helped or hindered the stone throwing. Regardless, reflecting on the happenings years later, Natalie has expressed how she very much believes in psychic things, and wonders if such was to blame for all that Thornton Road experienced in the 1980s. Whatever the case, after 6 long years, the nightly stone throwing is said to have fizzled out and stopped. And so we are left with a peculiar tale, one which on its own could be dismissed as an odd yet forgettable ripple in the history books. However, as it is, the case of the Birmingham poltergeist does not stand alone, for stone throwing can strangely be said to be a hallmark of paranormal phenomena, particularly poltergeist. Indeed, a quintessential case previously covered on my channel is that of the Lothers Lane poltergeist. Occurring on the island of Grenada in 1934, the house in question was, similar to the Thornton Road case, reported to have been pelted by stones on a regular basis. The fabric of the building was likewise damaged, and police were summoned and stationed around the property. Nothing and no one was ever found. After the house mysteriously burned to the ground, local people decried witchcraft as the cause. Similar again is that of an incident dating to 19th century France. Once more, stones were thrown by unseen hands, resulting in a police investigation. Reported upon by the reputable Le Droit newspaper in June 1860, it is said that projectiles coming from no one knows where broke windows and even entered the home, striking people and causing severe bruises. Police were placed on surveillance, but it was not long before they too became targets for the invisible artillery, and they found it impossible to determine where the blows were coming from. In some cases, such as in the Birmingham poltergeist, projectiles are reported to be large, hefty rocks. In other cases, despite sound and physical damage being reported, no objects are found, suggesting, in addition to their thrower, that they too may boast a supernatural quality. Indeed, in the case of Eleonora Zugan, an adolescent today remembered as the Devil's Girl for her connection to a wide variety of poltergeist phenomena, stones that seemed to have apported out of thin air were said to have been hurtled against her house, manifested and propelled by an unseen force. Shockingly, even as far back as the 4th and 5th centuries, one finds records of stone-throwing poltergeists. In one example, Saint-Germain-du-Serre is chronicled as having encountered a dwelling with a half-ruined roof, which had been left uninhabited for a long time. The reason, supposedly, was dangerous and horrible. It was haunted in the most terrible way. When Saint-Germain and his companions spent the night camping at the ruins, they are said to have encountered an umbra terribilis, a terrible shade. Some manner of ghostly being whose appearance triggered a hail of stones to be launched at the already dilapidated walls of the ruin. The suggestion was that this mysterious spectral entity was the one responsible for the house's destroyed state. The episode is reported to have concluded after Saint-Germain invoked the name of Christ, commanding the shade to confess who he was and what he was doing there. The spectre, so it revealed to the saint, claimed to be the restless fragment of an unburied soul. Saint-Germain and his companions were then supposedly able to find the body, which had been buried in chains, and provide a proper burial. After that, the stone-throwing poltergeist was never seen again. And so we are faced with an overwhelming list of eyewitnesses across both place and time. Cases of stone throwing in which a wholly material explanation is difficult to find. Even I can claim a personal experience of stones being thrown by unseen hands, a bizarre and frightening incident which I may share in future over on my second channel. For whatever reason, stone throwing appears time and time again to be a strong symptom of the supernatural, which, when considered in relation to Thornton Road, provides a possible insight into why the case to this day remains unsolved. There was no one to catch. No one visible and material anyway. Of course, what a poltergeist may or may not be is up for debate, even within paranormal circles, with everything from noisy spirits and umbra terribilis to psychic phenomenon and subconscious exteriorization being theorized. Whatever the case, one thing is certain. It is highly, highly unlikely that a vandal operating a high-powered catapult lay in wait outside the houses of Thornton Road every night for 6 long years, launching rocks at housewives and their children in 1980s England. Even the dead could come up with a better explanation than that. Gary Little was just 10 years old when he played with a Ouija board for the first time. An ordinary boy from County Derry, Northern Ireland, the year was 2004 and he was walking home from school. Drawn away from his usual route by an instinctual telling, he found himself wandering off the track close to the river, towards a mound of household waste illicitly dumped alongside the waterway. Half buried amongst bits of broken glass and abandoned appliances, Gary spotted something interesting. A large wooden rectangle, a board game of some sort. Adorned with engravings, the sun, the moon, the letters of the alphabet and the words yes and no, it was an old Ouija board. Familiar with the item from the scary films he had seen on TV, the 10-year-old boy was thrilled and proceeded to recover and clean the board. Little did he realize that his riverside discovery would forever change the course of his life, ultimately leading him and his terrified mother to monks and exorcists in an attempt to free him from the influence of a dark and mysterious figure named Tyrannus, the demon who was welcomed into his life via the board. My name is Laura, and you are watching The Paranormal Scholar. Gary's story comes to us most comprehensively via The Dark Sacrament, a book written and compiled by husband and wife duo David Keeley and Christina McKenna, specifically to shine a light on the work of 2 modern-day exorcists, Canon William H. Landrum and Father Ignatius McCarthy. It is the former, Canon Landrum, an Anglican priest from Belfast, who became involved in Gary Little's case. I knew it was time for the exorcism, Landrum told a journalist from the Guardian newspaper in 2005. The boy, so he explained, had been sent to him on the recommendation of a psychiatrist. For certainly, Gary Little's life had entirely unravelled since the day he found the Ouija board dumped by the river. After all, he hadn't just found the Ouija board. According to the testimonies contained in Keeley and McKenna's book, the board had guided the boy to it, ensuring that he would pick it up and play with it. In addition to the preternatural sensation that drew him from his usual path home, when Gary discovered the board half buried in the earth, it is said that a second item revealed itself, flying up in the air over the boy. It remained suspended for a moment before floating gently down to settle on the board. It was a planchette, a small piece of wood shaped like a rounded triangle with a circle of glass at its centre. When the planchette united with the board, something even more extraordinary is alleged to have happened. An experience of hell and damnation. All at once, Gary heard men and women screaming from under the earth, shrieking, so the boy later explained, something like Bim I A. He did not know what it meant and was utterly terrified. The strangeness, however, was far from over and progressed to a fully fledged vision of hell. Held in place by an unseen force, the ground is said to have opened up in front of the 10-year-old boy, revealing a dark cavern-like space housing a figure seated on a throne. All around the throne were demons, hundreds of winged creatures who flew up towards the entranced child. Soon after this, Gary was released from his trance. He was still in the same place, beside the river and the mound of rubbish, the Ouija board at his feet. The cavern and the demons gone, he jumped up, grabbed his school bag, and ran all the way home. At home, it was immediately clear to his mother Jessica that something was wrong. He seemed nervous and unable to settle. A mere half an hour later, she supposedly heard a scream come from the staircase. Rushing from the kitchen, she is said to have found her son halfway up the stairs, open-mouthed and staring, his hand tightly gripping the handrail. When she tried to comfort him and find out what was wrong, it was as though Gary couldn't hear her. His eyes were straight ahead, fixated on something at the top of the stairs. Jessica, however, couldn't see anything and had no idea why her son was acting so scared. When her other child, an 8-year-old girl with the pseudonym Kelly, giggled at her brother's odd behavior, the boy is said to have snapped from his trance. Turning, he looked at his little sister. It was, so his mother has explained, a look of pure hatred, one which was entirely out of place on the face of an otherwise sweet and ordinary 10-year-old. Frightened, Jessica instinctively pulled her daughter away from Gary, after which the boy continued up the stairs. From that day forward, things are claimed to have changed in the house. A usually harmonious Gary and Kelly would get into arguments, the older sibling shouting and, uncharacteristically, swearing at his little sister. On one occasion, Kelly even claimed that her brother had grabbed and twisted her arm, hurting her as he threatened to kill her. 2 days later, Gary laid hands on her again, this time supposedly punching her so hard in the face that the last of her baby teeth fell out. Their mother simply did not understand what was going on. Before she could attempt to find out, however, the situation escalated to new and alarming heights. Gary collapsed and had a seizure. At first, his limbs jerked violently, and then he was still, eyes staring straight up at the ceiling. A doctor was immediately summoned. Gary was okay, for now, with tests being arranged at the hospital for the very next day. He underwent a cardiogram and samples of his blood were taken. The neurologist also ordered an EEG. In all cases, the results were normal. No sign of a weak heart, of diabetes, or of abnormal electrical activity in the brain that may have suggested epilepsy. Gary was the perfect picture of health. And yet his mother worried that he wasn't. He had no memory of the incident. Not only that, his collapse had lasted almost an hour, far in excess of the 5 minutes typically associated with epileptic seizures. Her worrying, however, was only to increase. A few days later, she learned that Gary had a new friend, a man called Tyrannus. Her son told her that he had met him at the river. "It was the man I saw on the throne," he supposedly said. "The one that was like the devil, only it wasn't the devil. It was Tyrannus." Recalling the eerie incident on the stairs, when Gary had frozen upon his return home after discovering the Ouija board, the boy explained Tyrannus had been there also. "He was huge," the boy explained to his mother. "He was 10 times bigger than me. A big man, dressed in black." The 10-year-old boy also revealed that Tyrannus had been covered in dirt and rotten stuff, as though he had come from the ground. Sinisterly, the dark man had also exhibited multiple deep cuts and wounds. Not knowing what to say or do, Jessica could only stare at her son. She did not want to encourage whatever imaginary character had grown, so she thought, from the horror movies that he too readily consumed. And yet, before she could chastise or otherwise speak to him, Gary mentioned something else: the Ouija board. Until that point, his mother had had no idea as to its existence. Tyrannus, so the boy blurted out, had followed him home after he had dug up the board. Gary returned to school the following week, yet there was clearly still something wrong. He continued to speak of Tyrannus and suffered a complete change of personality. He would swear and shout and was even accused of bullying other students at school. Then Jessica found out that he returned to the river. When she asked him what he had been doing there, Gary is said to have snapped. He swore at his mother, later picked a fight with his little sister, and then, dreadfully, suffered another seizure. Hospital tests once again failed to diagnose a health problem, and so Gary was referred to a psychiatrist, with the onset of puberty suggested as the cause of his behavioral issues. Gary was invited to attend an extended course of psychiatric treatment, weekly sessions of Gestalt therapy, a form of psychotherapy that emphasizes personal responsibility, focusing on self-awareness and present moment experiences rather than the past. Things seemed to be going well, with both the boy's doctor and his mother happy with his progress. And yet, before too long, Jessica received a phone call from Gary's school. He had had another seizure. Only a few days later, he suffered another. On that occasion, it was witnessed by the family's neighbor who had been babysitting at the time. After Jessica rushed home from a shopping trip, her neighbor told her that she needed to take her son to see a priest. Gary was unclean, the neighbor explained, touched by evil. A deeply religious woman whose home was decorated with saints' relics and statues of Christ and the Virgin Mary, she was adamant that such was what the boy needed. A priest would help. And so it was, upon the neighbour's recommendation, that Jessica arranged to meet with a Catholic monk from a Cistercian monastery located in a neighbouring county. In the testimony featured in Keeley and McKenna's book, the monk is described as having been a healer with many years' experience. At the monastery meeting, Gary is said to have revealed more information about his experiences to the monk, including how the man on the throne from his vision, Tyrannus, had promised him a life of success and comfort if only the boy did as he wanted him to do. He says, "I'll have great power in the future," Gary is claimed to have told the monk. The dark figure is even said to have further entranced the boy, showing him visions of an office with a big desk. Arguably oddly stale things for a 10-year-old boy to fantasize or invent, when one of such an age might be more inclined to dream of becoming a fireman, footballer, or pop star. There were also noises and shadows, so the boy explained to the monk. Scary things that he would see and hear in the night whilst trying to sleep. When asked to provide more details, he said the sounds were akin to animals in the ceilings and walls, and that the shadows were big and black. In response to all of this, the monk is said to have instructed both the boy and his mother how to pray properly. There was, so he explained privately to Gary's mother, an evil at work. The monk then supposedly attempted to impress upon Jessica the reality of the devil and his demons, and how none of this was to be taken lightly. Gary needed to resist. He was, in short, playing with fire and had no doubt continued to use the Ouija board, speaking with Tyrannus, entertaining his offers of wealth and power, even after he'd claimed he had abandoned the board at the riverside. Jessica was overwhelmed. Belief in things like demons and the devil, God even, did not come easily to her. Even so, she is said to have taken the monk's advice, supervising Gary in prayer twice a day after the monastery meeting. In addition, the boy continued attending therapy sessions with his psychiatrist. And so, perhaps, the situation would have resolved. Yet, before too long, Gary is said to have slackened in regards to his prayers. He recited them less and less, and then altogether stopped. There seemed to be no consequence, and so his mother was unconcerned, until the day that she found him entranced and scribbling when he ought to have been completing his homework. Summoned into the room by her frightened daughter, Jessica was shocked to see her son writing in his non-dominant left hand, frantic and fixated, staring straight ahead. The words and phrases were obscene. Not only that, he supposedly made drawings too, of little designs resembling the signs of the zodiac and 5-pointed stars. When Jessica tried to remove the pen and paper from her son's hand, it was as though he were made of rock. The entranced boy continued to write. Increasingly desperate and scared, Jessica is then said to have grabbed him around the waist so as to pull the chair away from underneath him. Horrifically, the boy supposedly remained rigid and seated, as if the chair was still there, his hands still scribbling furiously in midair. As Jessica lowered her son to the floor, he allegedly collapsed and fell unconscious. When he eventually opened his eyes, he had no recollection of any of it. "I was sick with worry," his mother later explained during her interview. She had, in all seriousness, thought her son was about to die. It was this sensational episode that led Jessica to Canon William Landrum, an Anglican exorcist with 31 years of experience. With no other options available to her, she and her son made the journey to Landrum's Belfast home in early 2005. The first time he came here, the boy seemed very nervous, Landrum explained in an article about the case for the Guardian newspaper. Interviewed later by Keeley and McKenna for their book, The Dark Sacrament, Landrum went into more detail, expressing how he was struck by the way Gary answered his questions. The boy was confident, intelligent, articulate, even as he explained to the Reverend that he still played with the Ouija board and that it told him that he shouldn't read the Bible. "It says it's rubbish," the boy allegedly said. When Landrum pressed him, asking Gary how it told him such things, the boy's answer was chilling. He would ask the board questions, but only questions that the voice told him to ask. The voice, so it was revealed, was that of Tyrannus. Unsettled, the priest studied the boy, looking deep into his eyes. What he saw is said to have been indescribable. Somehow, Gary's eyes did not match the rest of his appearance. They were, so the priest attempted to explain to his interviewers, old beyond his years. The suggestion was that the boy, if not possessed, was at the very least under the partial control, influence or affliction of the dark entity named Tyrannus. Canon Landrum would counsel Gary for a couple of months before deciding in late February 2005 that it was time for an exorcism to be attempted. Speaking to The Guardian for an interview less than a week later, he explained how he said a few prayers and then looked into the child's eyes and commanded the spirit to depart. Unlike the Hollywood scenes one might be used to seeing, it is said to have been quiet and dignified, and when it was over, the boy seemed content in himself. In Keeley and McKenna's book, Gary's body is said to have shook when the priest commanded the demonic force to leave the boy alone. The boy is described as laughing, although not necessarily in his voice, but rather in the voice of Tyrannus. Eventually, the laughing ceased and the boy went quiet. He then promised Landrum that he would go with another reverend to find and destroy the Ouija board, and that from that day forward he was ready to accept the Holy Spirit into his heart. Unfortunately, as positive as this interaction may seem, this story does not have a happy ending. Gary did not find and destroy the Ouija board with the other reverend. Instead, it was suspected that he moved it, concealing it somewhere in his grandmother's house, with her going on to suffer what are described as strange noises and shadowy manifestations. And so he continued to use the board, continued to speak with Tyrannus. In 2007, some 3 years after his initial discovery of the board, Gary was even happy to tell the authors of The Dark Sacrament that he continued to use it because he was bored. At the point of the book's publication, his behaviour, according to his mother, was still changed, with him, despite her best efforts, no longer having any desire to cooperate with monks and exorcists. In fact, he is said to have developed a full-blown hatred for anything sacred, refusing to even enter a church. In terms of a medical explanation for his seizures and behavioural problems, his doctors were likewise unable to provide further assistance to the family. There was, in their opinion, no reason for his symptoms, either physical or psychological. And so, as far as we are aware, Gary remained happy to exist alongside the entity he claimed was called Tyrannus, an entity no one else had ever seen, an entity brought into his life via a discarded Ouija board. In this way, it is easy to point out the possibility of a young, self-admitted bored boy having engineered this entire fantastical tale. And yet, whilst it may be true that there is no way to guarantee this case's validity, it is curious to note its consistencies with other cases of the strange and inexplicable, most especially those alleging demonic influence. Epileptic-type seizures, for example, are often reported, most memorably in the disturbing and extreme cases of Anneliese Michel and Gottliebin Ditters. In regards to the latter, the young woman said to have fallen under demonic influence is claimed to have had seizures that would last for hours, with the doctor who tended to her helpless to do anything at all. Such is undoubtedly similar to the experiences of Gary Little, especially when one considers how, despite his access to modern medical testing, a diagnosis of epilepsy was ruled out. The various paranormal phenomena reported in Gary's story can also be said to be further reinforced when compared to other cases, with strange sounds and visions commonly being reported. Anneliese Michel, for example, spoke in 1973 of Rowton, ghastly demonic faces that she would see whenever she felt evil come into her. The fact that a Ouija board served as a vessel for evil again links to other cases, including the classic 1940s story of Roland Doe, or Robbie Mannheim, the real-life demon-plagued boy at the centre of William Peter Blatty's fictional novel The Exorcist. It is claimed that Robbie was inspired to experiment with a Ouija board after watching his aunt use one. A 1990s example is that of Estefania Gutierrez and the series of tragic occurrences that took place after a botched Ouija board session in the Vallecas area of Madrid, Spain. Black demonic smoke is said to have entered the teenage girl's body after the board was broken in two. She subsequently suffered seizures, hellish visions, and encounters with dark, shadowy entities. Even the name of the so-called demon Tyrannus is worthy of discussion. Whilst it is true, as is rightly pointed out by the authors of The Dark Sacrament, that the name was present in pop culture at the time of Gary's experiences, for example as the character Darth Tyrannus in the Star Wars franchise, and thus may have been accessible to Gary in terms of childish fictional invention, it must also be said that, in terms of lore and legend, demonic entities do not easily give up their real names. Indeed, much of the work of a Catholic exorcist, for example, may be to force the true name of a demon possessing a human vessel. Tyrannus might therefore conceivably have been a false name given by a demonic entity, carefully selected in order to lure and delight a 10-year-old boy, providing thrilling associations with big-screen supervillains and even the dark dread of the Tyrannosaurus Rex, a fake name to suit a demon's dark game. And so, considering all of this, are we then observing a universal phenomenon, that of demonic oppression and possession? Many, including the exorcists, Catholic, Anglican and otherwise, still at work in Northern Ireland and in other places around the world would say so. Not only that, exorcisms and the demand for exorcists are on the rise. That is not to say that all cases are true, but that, as the Cistercian monk Gary was taken to see has explained, by making God look archaic and outmoded, as is undoubtedly the case today, the devil creates a vacuum in the lives of the susceptible, which he, the enemy, can then move in to fill. Saint Michael, Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray, and do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the divine power, thrust into hell Satan and all the other evil spirits who prowl about the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. It was a reddish, human-like bite mark. Described by Dr. Mariano B. Lara in his official account of Clarita Villanueva, it is said to have appeared on the troubled young woman's body in 1953 during a state of partial trance. The wound was fresh, moist even, and bore distinct impressions that were mostly from the form of the front or incisor teeth. The only issue was, Clarita hadn't been bitten, at least not by anything human, at least not by anything visible. The wound was inexplicable. And sensationally, this was not the only time that the 18-year-old Filipino woman was said to have been attacked and bitten by a pair of dark aggressors which she collectively called the Thing. Imprisoned in Manila's old Bilibid prison after being arrested for vagrancy, Clarita Villanueva experienced 2 weeks of terrifying altered states of consciousness during which she was mysteriously assaulted and bitten by devils, with physical wounds being observed by multiple witnesses, including doctors. Indeed, according to a reporter for the United Press, Clarita was surrounded by about 100 medical specialists, nurses and pressmen, with fellow inmates and prison guards also testifying to her strange behaviour. Before too long, international media dubbed her the Dracula Girl, with the bizarre happenings and the reasons for them unresolved to this day. My name is Laura, and you are watching The Paranormal Scholar. Clarita Villanueva traveled to the Philippine capital city of Manila in search of her father. The youngest of 4 children, she had been forced to fend for herself after her mother died when she was just 12 years old. Abandoned by her older brothers and with no other immediate family to care for her, she wondered whether her father, an absent unknown who she had never met and indeed knew nothing of, might be interested in her. And so it was, not even knowing if he were alive, that an impoverished Clarita found herself on the streets of Manila. At first a maid, and then, when that ended badly, struggling to survive as a dance hostess in bars and taverns. On the 6th of May 1953, desperate and soliciting illegal activities in order to survive, an 18-year-old Clarita was arrested by a plainclothes police officer. It was to Manila's old Bilibid prison that she was taken to await trial. A colossal 6-acre penal facility notorious for overcrowding and poor conditions that had functioned as a prisoner of war camp during Japanese occupation of the island. Placed in a cell with 2 other women, Clarita passed 2 days without remark. It was on the 3rd day, in the middle of the night, that the first strange thing is said to have happened. Stones were heard hitting the floor of her cell. Waking Clarita and her cellmates, there was no obvious origin to the sound, with the prison guard who was summoned to their door telling the women to be quiet and return to sleep. So disturbed, Clarita struggled to rest, most especially when she realized she was being watched by something in the darkness of the cell. Up within the beams of the room was, so she later claimed, a thing. It was then that Clarita was attacked. Pinned to the bed by whatever had just leapt down from the beam so as to be on top of her, she was savagely bitten, screaming and all but paralyzed by fear. Her cellmates once again woke, with the guard similarly returning to the door. When questioned and asked what had happened, Clarita repeated that it had been the thing. Encouraged to elaborate, the terrified young woman described how she had been attacked by 2 figures. Some manner of short creature with white hair, an angelic face and a big mustache, and an evil-looking man dressed entirely in black. The latter had been tall and covered in hair. Both had bitten her, and even as she explained to the original guard and the others who were fast arriving at the cell, were continuing to do so. Not only that, there were bite marks on her body to prove it, with the prison guards later testifying that they had indeed seen the many red circular wounds manifest in real time on the young woman's torso, neck, shoulders, upper arms and leg just above the knee. Certainly, according to one contemporary account printed in the Philippines Free Press, it appeared as though Clarita was being attacked by an invisible monster, with her cowering in stark terror, screaming in blood-curdling agony before wilting to the floor. As for the wounds, sometimes she did not need to point to the fresh teeth marks on her arms or neck, because the bites were too pronounced to escape notice. With the attack ongoing and seemingly unable to be stopped, it was impossible for prison staff to calm the young woman, and so the prison chaplain, along with a police medic and the chief of the Manila Police Department, was summoned to the cell. They were able to extract more information from the terrified young woman, including further details as to the appearance of the thing, before she eventually calmed. All in all, she is said to have endured 20 separate bites that night. The following day, the story was published in a daily newspaper, with it said that the larger of the 2 attackers had bore 2 fangs and large, sharp eyes. He had supposedly spoken to Clarita in a deep voice and had curly hair all over his body. Big and dark, descriptions of the unearthly predator were likewise featured in a story published by another Philippine paper the following day again. And so, before too long, all of the Philippines knew of the girl who had been bitten by devils. As for those at the prison, an initial investigation led to a diagnosis of insanity, with it said by the medical staff of the Manila Police Department that Clarita had simply bit herself during epileptic fits. Subsequently, another medical authority declared her affliction, and presumably the bites which manifest on her body, to be a simple case of malnutrition. Another, an army psychiatrist of the Victoriano Luna General Hospital, concluded that Clarita's case was one of hysterical fugue. Succinctly, that past trauma, marked by sudden travel or wandering away from home, had caused her to enter a dissociative state in which she had attacked herself, then blamed it on unseen monsters. And yet none of this could explain what those at the prison had seen with their own eyes. The inexplicable appearance of bite marks, red, moist and toothed, on the skin of a young woman who seemed to be under attack by an invisible force. For indeed, according to an employee at the jail who spoke with the Philippines Free Press, the strange manifestations were like the wind. The wind cannot be seen, but it can inflict physical damage, just like the thing. Unseen, but undoubtedly real. After the first night, things did not improve for Clarita. The incarcerated woman, for whatever reason, was still crying in agony, writhing and convulsing, displaying eerie and unearthly bite marks all over her body. Being seemingly bitten to insanity, in moments of lucidity, she was able to confide that she had been experiencing such attacks before her arrest, with the 3rd of May supposedly marking the start of her torment. Now under the care of the chief medical examiner of the Manila Police Department, Dr. Mariano Lara, Clarita was once again subjected to professional scrutiny. According to Dr. Lara's report, he found the woman to be nervous and childish, as was befitting her young age, with his request on the 13th of May to examine the bite marks being initially circumvented. Clarita, so he wrote, told him to return to her cell later in the day, sometime past midday, about 2 o'clock, when the thing causing the bites would come again. From his report, it is clear that, like his assistant before him, Dr. Lara did not entertain the notion of an invisible thing having caused the bites, and instead suspected epilepsy and maybe even insanity. Still, Clarita's well-being was an ongoing concern, with her rapidly developing a fever. And so it was at 2:30 p.m. on the 13th of May, after a brief trip to the hospital, Clarita was brought to his office. According to the doctor's official report, she was unconscious and entirely insensitive to all stimuli and had to be carried in, her state presumably caused by having endured yet another entranced attack by the thing. Once she began to rouse, Dr. Lara was able to examine her injuries. Her arms, so he reported, bore reddish human-like bite marks. Not only that, a fresh one manifested in the middle of his examination. According to the doctor's description, Clarita was in a semi-trance and cried out in pain when it happened. And so, much to his disbelief, Dr. Lara had become a witness to the phenomenon. I saw, so he wrote, with my unbelieving eyes, the clear marks of impressions of human-like teeth from both the upper and lower jaws. Horrifically, the area that had been bitten was a little moist, with Dr. Lara concluding that he could not find any possible explanation insofar as my human experience in medical training is concerned. Simply put, it was a mystery. In this way, Dr. Lara went on to share his examinations in a 45-minute radio broadcast. This broadcast caught the attention of Lester Sumrall, an American Pentecostal pastor and missionary who believed in the power of miracles. And Clarita Villanueva, he was determined, would be his miracle. In his later written account, Sumrall described praying to God, asking him to deliver Clarita from her suffering which, after listening to Dr. Lara's broadcast, he was convinced was supernatural in origin. God, so Sumrall claimed, replied to him in his heart, telling him, "If you will go to the jail and pray for her, I will deliver her." Hence, this is exactly what Lester Sumrall did. Sumrall, who, along with his family, spent many years in the Philippines during the 1950s, arranged to meet with Mayor Arsenio Lacson, requesting that he be allowed to visit Clarita in prison so as to pray for her. Already acquainted with the case, the mayor had been in the process of seeking a Catholic exorcism for the young woman, and so was happy to assign Sumrall to her case. When Dr. Lara, who was still ultimately responsible for Clarita's care, was asked his opinion, he was reportedly convinced, telling Sumrall that he was humble enough to admit that he was a frightened man. For certainly there was much to fear. Not only was Clarita's affliction, in the eyes of Dr. Lara and other witnesses, medically inexplicable, it also posed the terrifying possibility that any one of us could be attacked at any time by violent unseen forces. If such was true, finding a cure was absolutely necessary. Sumrall's first meeting with Clarita Villanueva took place on the 19th of May. By now, the young woman had been suffering at the hands of the thing for over 2 weeks. And, if the missionaries' descriptions are to be believed, the activity had evolved in a very bad way. Clarita was slipping into demonic possession. Thus, after his initial meeting, during which Clarita is said to have made blasphemous statements, expressing hatred towards both the pastor and God, Sumrall made the decision to fast for 24 hours, so as to be spiritually prepared to confront what he believed to be a demon on the 22nd of May, and hopefully deliver the young woman as God had promised. According to a report published in the Philippines Free Press, the journalist found Lester Sumrall in Clarita's cell, along with a collection of other prominent witnesses, kneeling on the cement floor before the stricken girl, holding both her hands by the wrists, praying. Dr. Lara was amongst those present, a man, so the article reminds the reader, who was accustomed to opening cadavers in the Manila Police Department morgue without batting an eyelash. Even so, he was shaky, wiping tears away from his own eyes as he watched on. After all, even as Sumrall prayed for Clarita's deliverance, she was still being bitten afresh by the indefatigable, invisible thing. In the words of the journalist, the sight of the bite sent a cold shiver down our spine. It did not in any way resemble a human bite. In the first place, it was too large for human teeth. In the second place, the bite was completely round. And finally, we were awed to discover that all the teeth marks appeared to have been made by molars. When the time came for the exorcism to begin, Sumrall at first insisted that exorcising the evil spirits was not a show, and that the journalist and additional onlookers should be kept away. As it was, they eventually found their way back into the cell. There, it is said that when Sumrall invoked the Lord to liberate this little creature from the devil, Clarita's countenance changed. She, so the journalist wrote, became wild-eyed and screamed at the minister before her, telling him to go away. It is even said by some that she spoke in tongues and the English language, something which, outside of her entranced state, she supposedly had no knowledge of. Through all of this, Sumrall remained. Alternating prayer and sacred song with invocations for the Lord's help, the pastor is said to have been unconcerned by Clarita's vocal and, on occasion, violent protestations. Indeed, at one stage of the proceedings, so the later news report alleged, the young woman became so violent and hysterical that she fainted. Even so, after about an hour, she is said to have started to soften. She supposedly became more attentive to the pastor, even responding that she liked Jesus Christ when questioned. They recited the Lord's Prayer together. After that, gesturing to the window of the cell, she stated that the thing had fled. She was, so she told Sumrall, no longer afraid of it or what it could do to her. At that, so the journalist wrote in 1953, a joyous hallelujah was sung. Just as Sumrall had hoped, the miracle of God came upon her. In the days and weeks that followed, Clarita is said to have escaped demonic relapse, with Sumrall continuing to follow her through the justice system, petitioning for her release when she was ultimately assigned to the Welfareville Institution for Wayward Girls. Today, the story of Clarita Villanueva is remembered as an early successful instance of Pentecostal exorcism, which in the 1950s was largely unheard of, such a right usually the reserve of the Catholic exorcist. It is also, according to some, one of the earliest manifestations of Christian-style demons in the Philippines. And this is very interesting. After all, the involvement of Lester Sumrall and the designation of demonic possession has firmly established the Clarita Villanueva case as a Christian story. Summarily, that the devil and his minions terrorized a sin-ridden youth so as to mark her soul for hell. And, undeniably, this story does share many similarities with more traditional cases of demonic possession. For example, Clarita's aversion to the sacred, shown both when she expressed her hatred for the pastor and God, and also earlier in the story, before Summerall's involvement, when she supposedly attempted to smash a statuette of the Virgin Mary. The holy ornament belonged to one of her cellmates, and it was only spared destruction after the two other women restrained the incensed young woman. Such, arguably, is a cut-and-dry hallmark of diabolical influence. In this way, much can be said about the Philippines being the most Christian-dominated society in the Southeast Asia region. Although the country is a secular state with freedom of religion, irreligion is very low, with Christianity being the dominant belief by a vast majority. Might it then be said that Clarita was merely acting out along Christian lines? A troubled young woman, undoubtedly influenced by Catholicism, seeking attention in an attempt to escape judicial punishment. Quite certainly, many skeptics will and have argued for such an explanation. And yet this, in many ways, misses a more interesting point. After all, if we dig a little deeper, a treasure trove of intrigue can be found. Certainly, whilst it is incontestable that much of what Clarita demonstrated, from the aversion to holy objects to her initial rejection of Christ, intersects Christian expectations of the demonic, there is also a lot in this case that converses with traditional folk belief, and even a wider, more syncretic, culturally universal view of the unseen. Along these lines, one might consider the aswang, an umbrella term for various malevolent, shape-shifting creatures in Filipino folklore, including ghouls, vampires, and specifically viscera suckers. Clarita's thing in many ways resembles an aswang, a form-bending entity, at once a tall dark devilman and a small white-haired cherub that wanted nothing more, so it seems, than to bite her. Vampiric, ghoulish, flesh-sucking. In this way, her case can be said to look a little less like Catholic-influenced invention, and something which is more native to Filipino folklore. And the story becomes even more interesting when one examines a similar case, namely that of the Devil's Girl, the 11-year-old Romanian girl Eleonora Zugan, who, very similar to Clarita Villanueva, suffered moist, red, toothy bites all over her body after being attacked by an invisible being. In her story, which started in 1925, it was feared by some that she had fallen under the influence of a familiar spirit, a being described in Romanian folklore as elemental and temperamental, loyal if treated well, possessive and dangerous if neglected. Thought to have become attached to Eleonora after she picked up a silver coin she found discarded on a roadside, the familiar spirit would attack the girl in front of others, invisible to their eyes but able to, as one contemporary report alleged, cause distinct teeth marks to appear on her wrist, then score-like scratches on her right forearm, cheeks and forehead. Considering this, might it then be said that Clarita was experiencing something similar to that which Eleonora had encountered some 3 decades prior? After all, etheric shapeshifters and invisible fanged beings are hardly limited to the folk stories of just one part of the world. They are, in short, everywhere, and even overlap with the more formally recognized Christian concepts of the preternatural demonic, which are said to be able to influence human imagination to impersonate anything. The question is, why? Why is there so much overlap? In a world of separate cultures, different religions, and diverse languages, why does it seem that we all return to the same basic concepts? Of there being an other world that can influence our own, an other world that is populated by all manner of ethereal beings. Some of them angelic and divine, some of them dark and toothed, wanting to bite and scratch and dominate and destroy in whatever dim, constricted corner you are unfortunate enough to find yourself in. When Vanessa Mitchell moved into a new house in St. Osyth, Essex, England in 2004, she thought she had purchased her dream home. It was historic and beautiful, a house in the village where she had grown up. And yet, within just a few days of moving in, strange things are said to have happened. Small at first, the sorts of oddities that nobody usually pays much attention to, like the latches on the doors going or abnormal temperature changes, the activity eventually grew and grew and grew until Vanessa and her baby son were forced to banish themselves to a single room within the house. Too scared to occupy the space fully and increasingly fearful for her son's safety, Vanessa found herself financially trapped in a home which, so she explained during an interview years later, was trying to make her go mad, or worse, claim her life. For certainly, the building's history was a dark one. Known as the Cage, it had not always been a home. Used as a witch prison in the latter half of the 16th century, 14 women accused of malevolent witchcraft were kept there in 1582 while awaiting trial. 3 were found guilty, being subsequently sentenced to death and executed by hanging. In the decades and centuries since, many others have found themselves imprisoned in the Cage, including those quarantined during times of plague, with it now suggested that all the sorrow, death and despair witnessed by the building has left its mark in the form of hostile paranormal activity. The result being that the Cage of St. Osyth is now referred to as one of the most haunted houses in all England. My name is Laura, and you are watching The Paranormal Scholar. It is said that Vanessa Mitchell is the longest owner the Cage has had since records began, being listed for sale on average every 3 to 3.5 years for over the last 200 years. There is thus a suggestion that, once they have the keys, no one ever desires to stay in the visually creepy cottage for very long. When discussing her experiences with the paranormal files in 2019, Vanessa explained how she knew the first day something was in the house. And yet, financial restraints, including the turmoil engendered by the activity itself, forced her to remain living in the property for the next 3 years. A year after finding somewhere else in the village to live, she was able to list the property for sale. It wasn't until 2020, however, a full 12 years later, that she was able to find a buyer, with it suggested that the cottage's ongoing and increasingly hostile haunting had hampered its ability to be sold. Even one of the estate agents tasked with selling the Cage went on record to say that a high level of paranormal activity had been recorded at the property, and that such made it an unusual offering to have on his books. And so precisely what is said to have occurred at the Cage to trigger such infamy. In many interviews and accounts provided by Vanessa, she has been keen to stress the day-to-day nature of the haunting, describing how she would often feel as though there was someone else in the house with her. Speaking in 2019, she described how, over the years, she became aware of many different entities at the property. Referring to layers of spirits, she stated that there were both normal ones like children and malevolent ones that would, for example, manifest in the form of a black shadow figure. Said to have been a big black mass, Vanessa alleged to have seen it in her home multiple times. On one occasion, so she explained, it was so large and dominant that it went from the carpet and up the ceiling, appearing in broad daylight in front of her eyes as she sat in the front room. There was, in her mind, no mistaking what she had seen, and it was terrifying. During a 2012 appearance on British daytime television, Vanessa was asked to explain just how bad the property was. She responded by describing a typical day living at the Cage, saying that it was not unusual to experience items flying across the room, door latches moving, and the taps turning on by themselves. Elsewhere, she has spoken about electrical anomalies, such as how appliances like the kitchen kettle would be switched on by unseen hands. All of this added an extra uncomfortable dimension to Vanessa's experience, increased utility bills, and thus further financial entrapment at the cage. And so, supernatural anomalies were said to have been both daily and tremendously disruptive. In many ways, it seemed as though the cage was trying to incarcerate Vanessa Mitchell, just the same as it had done to many others over the course of its history. Indeed, it wasn't until 1908 that it ceased holding local delinquents and drunks before trial. Prior to that, the cage had imprisoned 14 women accused of witchcraft in 1582. Amongst them was a local healer and midwife called Ursula Kemp. Accused of having caused death by bewitchment, she was also said to have employed unholy spells and incantations as part of her healing services. The woman reportedly confessed to such witchcraft to an 8-year-old boy from St. Osyth, who then went on to testify against her during her trial. In this way, she and 2 others were found guilty and subsequently hanged. Speaking about this part of the building's history, terrorized owner Vanessa has stressed that she does not believe Ursula was a bad witch, but rather represented yet another victim of the cage. She has also highlighted the tragic fate of the children of such women. Without a mother to care for them, they would be left to fend for themselves, often perishing as a result. Vanessa believes that the children she frequently heard laughing and running around the upstairs of her home during the time that she lived there were the very same children, lingering on, looking for their mothers after death. And while such may be a cause of fright for many, it was not for Vanessa. It was instead the negative energy said to lurk in the house. The Black Mass, and so she has sensationally claimed, the spirit of a man who got in between her and her baby's son, and may have even attempted to end her pregnancy. Vanessa was 8.5 months pregnant with her son Jesse when she was supposedly pushed so hard that she fell over, or in her words, entirely hit the deck. Horrifically, she was upstairs, home alone at the time. Fortunately, she fell into the spare room, narrowly avoiding tumbling down the stairs. On another occasion, whilst brushing her teeth in the morning, she is said to have been hit so hard that she screamed and the toothpaste went up in the air. Then, later, after the birth of her son, Vanessa described doing some ironing in the old cell room. A 5-month-old Jessie was upstairs sleeping. Hurrying to finish the chore so as to return to him, Vanessa has explained how she became frightened after one of her son's toys started making noises and going around her feet. Abandoning the ironing, Vanessa immediately rushed for the stairs and her little boy. It was then, so she has claimed, that she saw someone standing at the top of the stairs. A man dressed in modern brown trousers and a white shirt, he stood between Vanessa and her baby son. It was then that she made the final decision to move out, regardless of the financial consequences. Away from the house, living in various rental properties and at one point even a caravan, the anomalous activity in Vanessa's daily life lessened. Even so, she was saddled with a mortgage on a place she could no longer live. She first attempted to rent the cage, yet, according to her testimony, renters lasted no longer than 4 months. And so, driven to the brink of exhaustion and nervous breakdown, she decided to list her once dream home for sale. It was at this point, over the course of the 12 years that it would take Vanessa to find a buyer, that other people were invited to experience the energy of the cage for themselves. After all, as she explained in a 2012 television interview, it was Vanessa's belief that the cage wants to talk. Why else, she posited, would it be so highly active? And whilst testimonies can be said to vary from one experiencer to the next, the general consensus from the numerous paranormal investigators, psychic mediums, and ghost hunt event groups is one of agreement. The cage does want to speak. For example, according to an early 2020 testimony from the Essex Live journalist Richard Brown, entities at the property seemed to make their presence known to him and other participants in an event company arranged paranormal investigation via electromagnetic disturbances. Brown described anomalies being detected by an EMF meter in response to questions asked, as well as there being a generally tense and creepy atmosphere. Other investigators, including Southwest London Paranormal, have reported similar, with it even claimed that the high level of paranormal activity and dark atmosphere of the cage has the ability to reduce visitors to tears. For example, in his 2019 book Poltergeist, paranormal researcher and Society for Psychical Research member John Fraser describes how one female investigator, anonymous for the purpose of his reportage, was suddenly reduced to tears on the stairs, could not stay in the building, and had to immediately arrange a lift to take her back home. Another investigator, once again anonymous, is stated by Fraser to have started crying after he was prodded and bruised on his leg in the lounge. On a different occasion a psychic medium who travelled to the property as part of a North London paranormal investigative group was forced to abort her investigation after sensing the spirit of a young girl in agony. Such extreme emotional reactions and physical assaults can be said to be reminiscent of what Vanessa Mitchell suffered during her time living at the cage. Here, it is also interesting to note that during Vanessa's occupancy, visiting friends and family, as well as a housemate who lived with her for the first year, also experienced strangeness, including violence and emotional changes at the property. One visitor, called Kirstine Blackwell, described as Vanessa's cousin in John Fraser's detailed report on the haunting, is said to have experienced being scratched by unseen hands, with blood even drawn. This was in addition to chest pains and headaches, as well as an intense feeling that she was about to be pushed. Others to have experienced sanguine sensationalism at the cage include two friends of Vanessa's called Kirsty and Neil. Ominously, the couple are claimed to have experienced blood splatters manifest in the front room. Explaining the story during a 2019 interview, Vanessa described how Neil, a sergeant major home on leave, was the first to see the blood trail. Despite immediately searching for an open window or injured animal, he was unable to find an explanation. In Vanessa's words, nothing was open. The blood had simply appeared in the time it took to boil the kettle, make a cup of coffee, and sit down. Other reports from the cage include references to dark apparitions, shape-shifting illusions, the hearing of aggressive growls, and, somewhat of a trope in haunting and poltergeist cases, the mysterious appearance of wet patches on the floor. When exploring the reasons why Vanessa and others may have experienced all that they have at the cage, those of a more skeptical inclination have put forward the role of suggestion, and how it may have had the power through the dark history of the building to influence Vanessa's expectations of the building when she was living there. Parapsychologist and Society for Psychical Research member Dr. Kieran O'Keefe has stated that there is a lot of psychology going on when we hear stories of witches. Such may prey on your mind and lead you to misidentify ordinary experiences, or indeed entirely imagine them. Dr. O'Keefe also suggested during a joint interview appearance with Vanessa in 2012 that there may be separate, ordinary explanations for the physical phenomena she experienced, including the electrical and plumbing anomalies. In short, just because several seemingly strange things happen doesn't mean they all have a common cause. And while such is an entirely valid argument, it is also intriguing to consider other, more anomalous explanations. After all, in his 2019 report on the cage, John Fraser concluded by stating that, whilst witness statements in themselves should not be expected to overturn the views of current science, the fact that the same sorts of phenomena have been experienced and reported by multiple independent parties should show beyond doubt that a case such as this should in no way be dismissed, even by those of a skeptical nature. Might it then be argued that the highly emotive history of the building, from witch trials to its use as a quarantine house in times of plague, has left an energetic mark on the very fabric of the building? The common term here is stone tape theory, the notion that mental impressions during traumatic or emotional events can be projected onto the very stones of a building to be replayed later, experienced as ghosts or other mysterious manifestations. Following on from this is the concept of mental atmospheres, spoken of by author and occultist William Walker Atkinson in his book Genuine Mediumship or the Invisible Powers. Not necessarily limited to hauntings and the realm of the paranormal, Atkinson suggests that when we occupy a space, we become conscious of an entire mental scale of many notes, the notes being sounded unconsciously by the minds of the occupants of the house. Such occupants could be both living and dead. Such spaces thus vibrate with the character of the thought and feeling of those who have interacted with them. In the case of the cage, a place of misery, incarceration, and death, one can only imagine what the character of thought and feeling may have been. Atkinson also writes that this character of thought and feeling is contagious and can thus greatly affect those who live in the space, given that they are constantly exposed to this mental atmosphere. Such arguably aligns with Vanessa's experience of the cage, particularly the remarks she has made over the years about the deterioration to her mental health that she experienced during her time living there. The house, so she explained in 2012, makes you depressed. Even those staying there for just a short time, overnight for a paranormal investigation, seem to have said similar. Vanessa also expressed how she would hear whispers in the house telling her to end her own life. And, both shockingly and tragically, the man who lived in the property before her did just that, with Vanessa being made aware of the incident prior to moving in. Might it therefore be that he was influenced by the dark and complicated mental atmosphere of the cage, and then, through his tragedy, added to it? In Vanessa's more recent interviews, she has spoken about her efforts to cleanse the property and sweep away the dark miasma which seems to plague it. Speaking in 2019, she explained how, after a long search, she had found the right people to be able to do it, including a lady from the United States who was able to travel to the property so as to cleanse and clear the house in the name of God. Although still said to be paranormally active, the cage is now described as much better, nothing like it used to be. Shortly afterwards, it finally sold, thus ending Vanessa's stewardship of what is claimed to be one of Britain's most haunted houses. Only time will tell if the activity continues, and for just how long its newest owner can stand to remain living there. In early June 2024, a young mother found herself driving to a car park in West Wales. It was not a journey she had intended to make. Indeed, nothing about her life for the past couple of weeks had been expected. Everything had been turned upside down. Hunted by large dark shadows, the inexplicable appearance of scratches and acid-like burns on her skin. Even her sleep had been disrupted. Subjected to a sudden and ever-escalating carnival of horror, she blamed her bizarre and terrifying experiences on an item that had recently entered her home. A seemingly innocuous glass cloche purchased new to house a personal memento. She had already tried and failed to rid herself of the object. It was almost as though it wanted to stay, a mind of its own determined to remain in her life and cause her more suffering. But now she had found someone to relieve her. Recommended to her by a mutual connection, the couple had offered to take the object from her. All she had to do was meet them in the car park. The menacing cloche and the mysterious claw marks which tarnished its glass surface sitting in the boot of her car. My name is Laura, and this is the true story of how I came to own a very strange and unsettling item indeed. This is not like the other stories I have presented on this channel. I did not read about this happening in a book, neither did I learn of it via a documentary, interview, or news story. This testimony and the item it concerns were given to me in person by a very scared individual. Other than our brief informal interview and the actual handing over of the object, she wanted nothing more to do with the case. While she gave permission to my husband Eric and I to talk about her experiences, she requested her identity be kept a secret. And so, for the purpose of this narration, I shall refer to her as Beth Ann, a false name for a true story. A very true story. For after taking possession of the glass cloche, Eric and I also went on to experience odd and at their worst plainly horrifying happenings. Others who have had a chance to interact with the item whilst visiting its new home, Eric and I's brand new paranormal museum, have likewise reported strangeness. But before we speak of recent events, let us start at the beginning, with Beth Ann, and how it was that she came to possess the item now known as the Gwythgi. The small glass bell jar came from an online retailer, purchased by Beth Ann, a young mother from West Wales, for the purpose of displaying a personal memento. It ought to have been like any other brand new item, fresh, impersonal, undamaged. And yet, when it arrived at her home, Beth Ann was disappointed to discover a series of scratch marks on the surface of the glass. Given the purpose of the object, decorative display, the tarnishes undermined the reason why she had bought it, and so she contacted the seller requesting a refund or replacement. The seller, however, was obstinate, refusing to do either, arguing that the item would have been unmarked when they sent it to her, and thus was not their responsibility. Not wanting to waste any more energy on the matter than she already had done, Beth Ann put the blemished cloche to one side and continued on with her life. That very same night, Beth Ann alleged to have experienced the first in a series of nightmares that would ultimately lead her to dispose of the object. In it, she was sitting on a chair in a dimly lit wooden cabin. There was, so she later described during her informal interview, an open fire and a doorway. She was facing the door when it opened, a large wolf-like figure rushing through it. Described as having been half man and half wolf, Beth Ann remained in the chair as the hairy bipedal terror moved towards her. The wolfman then opened his large canine jaws and, in one bite, severed the young woman's head from her body. The dream ended at this point, with Beth Ann waking absolutely terrified. As traumatic as the nightmare was for the young mother, she thought little of it in that moment. Everyone, after all, has bad dreams. And yet, disruption to her sleep continued, with, over the next few days, the horror seemingly entering waking life also, in the form of large shadows and other visual anomalies that began to manifest in her house. She would catch sight of them most often when she was home alone. One especially frightening anecdote, however, took place when she was driving. According to her testimony, a glimpse in the vehicle's mirrors led her to witness a dark and fast dog-like shape running behind her car down the middle of the road. Beth Ann was certain to state that there were no other vehicles on the road at that time, and that her sighting occurred in daylight hours. Despite it being a rural area, there was, as far as she was concerned, no natural explanation for the animalistic apparition that she saw sprinting behind her on the road. And so she was, in her own words, being hunted. Aggressive and seemingly canine in nature, whatever was responsible continued to affect her sleep, with both the frequency and intensity of her nightmares increasing day by day. The themes of the restless dreams were always the same. Violent wolves, black dogs, werewolves, red-eyed, canine-featured chimeras. She even claimed, albeit briefly and unsure, that oftentimes before she fell asleep, she would experience physical sensations. Strange scratches on her skin and what she called acid burns. When Eric and I met her that day in early June, she did not dwell on this, and seeing how clearly affected she was by the conversation, we did not feel it was appropriate or helpful to push her to reveal any more. And so it was, within the course of a mere 2 weeks, Beth Ann's life was destabilized beyond imagining. It was around this time that she rediscovered the glass cloche. Until that point, it, along with its scratched surface, had sat forgotten in her home. The conversation with the online retailer had led nowhere, the item thus losing its decorative purpose. When she picked it up, intending finally to dispose of it, she felt a rush of horror. Eyes transfixed on the damaged surface, the scratches took on a whole new and terrifying significance. They were claw marks. Canine, wolf-like claw marks. Not only that, the strange and frightening activity, nightmares and physical attacks she had experienced for the past 2 weeks had only started once the object entered her home. Bethan was thus convinced that the glass cloche, with its claw marks etched into its very surface, was somehow responsible. Chilled, she taped the bell jar shut and left it outside, on the pavement beyond the boundary of her home, for the bin men to remove along with the other waste that was scheduled to be collected. When bin day came, however, the glass cloche wasn't taken. For some unknown reason, it was left at Bethan's home, despite the rest of the recycling waste being removed. It is at this point in Bethan's story that Eric and I became involved. A mutual connection, a tradesperson with whom Eric had spoken about our work in the paranormal, knew that the young mother was struggling, and so suggested that she might like to phone us and get us to help. Our phone number was given, a call was made, and it was agreed that we would meet Bethan at a mutually convenient and anonymous location, a car park in West Wales. Everything went according to plan. We met, she told us about her experiences, we offered words of advice, then we parted ways. She without the glass cloche, Eric and I, its new owners. Artifacts with strange histories are nothing new to Eric and I. We have been collecting for years, both items of purely historic significance and those with uniquely bizarre backstories. And yet, less than a week after taking possession of the glass cloche, I came to realize that it was highly abnormal, even amongst abnormal items. Before opening our new paranormal museum in Carmarthen, Wales, Eric and I kept the more active and potentially problematic of our collection at home, in a special storeroom located inside an outbuilding on our property. There, the objects' unique and special needs could be catered to without interfering with our living, working and sleeping areas. 99% of the time, this was a more than adequate arrangement. Bethan's glass cloche was the exception, the 1%. The only item I have ever felt the need to remove from our property and store elsewhere. After taking the cloche home and securing it in our storeroom, both Eric and I began to experience phenomena similar to that which Bethan had reported to us during our car park meeting. Shadows, disrupted sleep. That by itself might have been resolvable. Then one day I went into the storeroom by myself. There I experienced sudden severe pain in my abdomen. It felt like I had been slashed across my middle by something sharp and acidic. After that, I knew that keeping the item at home was no longer an option. It risked further aggressive activity towards myself or someone else, or even an unsettling of the other objects in our care. That same afternoon, Eric and I bagged it and removed it to a safe place away from our home. At that time, still shocked by experiencing the physical sensation across my abdomen, I cared little if I ever saw that cloche again. When we took possession of our museum building in August, only a couple of months after being given the mysterious item by Bethan, we returned to retrieve it and move it to the museum, which is now its permanent home. It is a very cold and bad weather day in summertime Wales. And I am at... Oh! It was a squirrel running on the church roof. Okay, I'm at a graveyard that I know very well to retrieve an item, a very problematic item that I have had to store here whilst we waited to take possession of the museum. So I really didn't want this one at home. So, like I said, this is a place that I frequent often, and particularly the older graves. Well, quite a few graveyards in the local area. I like to go to them, pay my respects, read from the headstones, acknowledge the people who are resting there. particularly those who no longer get visitors, and say prayers for them. And that's something that I've done for years. So when this item came into my possession, it's not something that I wanted at home. So this particular graveyard I have a special connection to, and I asked the spirits of the graveyard, the keepers of the graveyards, to do me a favor, I suppose, and take care of this item until I could come back and retrieve it, which is what I'm doing now. Okay. Just have to remember where I put it. Okay. Oh, there it is. Okay. Saint Michael, Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the divine power, thrust into hell Satan and all the other evil spirits who prowl about the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. Bless you, Michael. I've got it. We call the glass cloche the Gwythgi, the Welsh term for a supernatural black dog or hellhound. Similar to the more commonly known Black Shuck of English legend, this mythical beast is described by those who allege to have encountered them to be incredibly vicious. A canine creature with fiery eyes that howls at night, searching for prey. Celtic tradition swarms with tales of this dog of darkness, with the folkloric animal most especially associated with lonely rural roads, much like Bethan's reported encounter with the dark and fast dog-like shape she saw whilst driving her car. While such myths might come across as fanciful and difficult to believe, it must be stressed that there are a surprising number of these reports of wolfish creatures in the present day. According to Mark Rees, a prominent Welsh author and folklorist, one such modern Gwythgi encounter took place on the south coast of Carmarthenshire, not far from our very own Rowton's museum, at the Corran Resort and Spa. The case centred on a night security guard who alleged to have become completely paralysed after taking a quick nap in one of the hotel's rooms. According to the man's testimony, he was trapped within his body by a huge black thing in the room with him. It supposedly resembled an oversized black Alsatian dog. After baring its teeth at the frozen security guard, the creature swiftly disappeared. Oddly, other employees at the now closed resort are also reported to have encountered the hellhound. One woman even alleged to have fled from the resort as fast as she was able after seeing the beast run across the bar one night. And so Wales, it seems, is teeming with hellish black dogs. As for the glass cloche Gwythgi housed at Rowton's museum, we are still attempting to unravel precisely how it came to be. During our car park conversation with Bethan, she hinted, although did not elaborate upon, how she believes someone in her personal life may have done this to her. A curse of sorts. Whether that was the ritualistic black magic binding of an etheric hellhound to an item, the projection of the evil eye, or even a canine tulpa creation sent to torment her by an enemy, it cannot be said. Here, consideration of the esoteric double might prove profitable, the traditional folk and shamanic concept that suggests we all have the ability to unlock at least one other version of ourselves. This other version can be human or animal, physical or ethereal. And that is not necessarily even to say that someone somewhere right now is astrally projecting themselves inside a glass cloche, in the strange territory of the paranormal that someone might not even be in the material. They might not even be human. All that can be said is that for Bethan, the anonymous young mother who hurried to relieve herself of the item, The vicious, wolf-like creature which hunted her days and haunted her nights was very real, as were the things that Eric and I experienced in the aftermath, most especially the physical feeling of being attacked. For now, the item is contained at our Museum of the Paranormal, with a special regime of spiritual care regularly performed on and around its locked case. Even so, early visitors to the museum have already reported strangeness in its proximity, including words like hound and instructions to run away, having come through various word bank and spirit box devices and applications. Unease is common, especially in the dark. Given that Rowton's museum is very soon to open, with our first guided tours and seance evenings in our purpose-built Victorian-themed seance parlour scheduled for the 26th of October onwards, I imagine there will be other reports of similar activity. And so, at this point, I extend an invitation to any and all who dare to come and help Eric and I investigate not only the Gwythgi, but the other items in our collection this Halloween. There are still tickets available for our Halloween paranormal investigation, which you can purchase online via our website. Not only is it a chance for you to meet Eric and I, but also to have a tour of our artifacts and special building. And, regardless of your experience level, to experience the paranormal for yourselves on the spookiest night of the year. As for the Gwythgi, we cannot make any promises. You shall simply, as I always encourage you to do, have to decide for yourself what to believe. The Ammons family haunting is a notorious case. Famed for its tales of levitating children and a house plagued by 200 demons, it, despite occurring within recent living memory, has already gone down in the paranormal history books as one of the most extreme instances of diabolical haunting ever to enter public consciousness. Indeed, the happenings attributed to 3860 Carolina Street in Gary, Indiana, are said to have been so horrific that there was only one solution: the destruction of the property in January 2016. Such was, according to those who had experienced its horror firsthand, the only way to prevent the dark forces which inhabited the building from causing more harm. After all, in addition to the preternatural activity and demonic possession that it unleashed upon the Ammons family, Indiana's infamous Demon House is also claimed to have been responsible for ghost-hunting heavyweight Zach Bagans' medical diagnosis of double vision, the mysterious organ failure of experienced paranormal investigator Dr. Barry Taff, and even a terrible instance of attempted suicide. My name is Laura, and you are watching The Paranormal Scholar. This is a piece of 3860 Carolina Street, Gary, Indiana, a place which ought to have had nothing unusual about it. Just another ordinary single-story house on just another ordinary American road. And yet, shortly after LaToya Ammons and her family moved into their new rental home in November 2011, it became apparent that there was nothing ordinary about the building at all. Just days after moving in, the family are said to have experienced inexplicable swarms of big black flies. In the words of Rosa Campbell, the mother of LaToya who also lived in the house, "We killed them and killed them and killed them, but they kept coming back." It was horror movie-esque, a very bad beginning for what was meant to be a new start. After the flies came the sound of footsteps in the basement. The kitchen door, which led down to the basement, would also creak open by itself and even boom as though someone was banging on the other side. Soon after that, grandmother Rosa Campbell is said to have observed the shadowy figure of a man pacing the living room floor at night. When she investigated, large wet boot prints were inexplicably discovered. By the spring of 2012, the family were thus in the stranglehold of unseen supernatural strangeness. An event which marked an increase in the severity of the activity is said to have happened one night when Rosa, LaToya and her children and a group of friends had gathered at the house to mourn the passing of a loved one. It was the early hours of the 10th of March at around 2 a.m. when LaToya was shocked to discover her 12-year-old daughter levitating above her bed, entirely unconscious. According to a 2014 interview with the Indianapolis Star newspaper, those in the house, including Rosa and LaToya, quickly surrounded the girl and began to pray. They continued until she descended. When she woke up, she supposedly had no memory of the gravity-defying occurrence. As for the others who were claimed to have witnessed it, they, so Rosa reported to the press, refused to return to the house. It was perplexing, a seemingly unsolvable mystery. After the alleged levitation of LaToya Ammons' 12-year-old daughter, the family decided they needed help. It is said that they contacted several churches with no result. Eventually, officials from one church offered to help. Sensationally, they instructed the family to purify their home by cleaning it with bleach and ammonia, and by drawing crosses in oil on all of the doors and windows. The property was, after all, inhabited by malevolent spirits. The church's advice, however, did little to alleviate the family's woes. Even when the desperate mother and grandmother anointed the children's hands, feet, and brows with the same oil, there was no result. In fact, the activity was steadily worsening, with it even reported that the older son was thrown across the room by an invisible force. And so it was, increasingly distressed and fearful for her children's safety, LaToya Ammons contacted 2 clairvoyants for help. Unlike the church, their advice was simple: move. In a ghastly revelation, the psychics informed the family that there were some 200 demons inhabiting the house. There was, in short, no fixing the situation. And yet, moving was not an option for the cash-strapped family. When speaking with a journalist from the Indianapolis Star 2 years later, LaToya and her mother explained that they instead pursued methods to alleviate what was, by now, looking more and more like diabolical oppression. Mother and daughter established a Christian altar in the basement of the house. White candles, religious icons, and the Bible upon it. The Holy Book open at Psalm 91, a sacred song traditionally deployed to invoke God's protection against the terror of the night and other deadly plagues, pestilences, and deeds of the wicked. LaToya and a friend also, upon the suggestion of the clairvoyants, dressed in white and walked through the house, burning sage and sulfur top to bottom while reciting the same biblical poem aloud. As they did this, the distressed mother drew a cross in the air with the smoke. According to LaToya's testimony, their ritual offered respite for 3 days. Once that time passed, however, the activity is said to have returned, worse than ever before. It is at this point that LaToya Ammons claimed that she and her children were all possessed by demonic entities. Speaking later in a video interview, LaToya explained how the family's experiences were very real, and that even though a lot of people don't like to think about it and live their lives day to day, demons can possess a human body, and even claim a soul, driving someone to do the unthinkable. As the activity increased for her family, this was a genuine cause for concern. After all, it is said that evil smiles would manifest on the children's faces, their voices deepening as they shouted horrific things at their mother, siblings, and grandmother. The youngest boy, in particular, is described as having growled, "It's time to die," and "I will kill you," at his family. His eyes rolled into the back of his head as he did. The then 7-year-old is also said to have sat inside a closet in the house talking to a boy that no one else could see. Supposedly, the unseen child was telling LaToya's son what it felt like to be killed. As for the mother herself, she spoke in terms of the supernatural coming over her body, making her feel weak, lightheaded, and warm. This was possession, and she could tell it was different. Her body shook, and she felt out of control. LaToya's 12-year-old daughter, who had previously been made to levitate at the hands of the unseen, reported further nighttime encounters, later telling health professionals that she would sometimes feel as though she was being held down in bed at night and choked. Unable to move, a voice would then speak to her, telling her that she would be gone within 20 minutes, and as such would never see her loved ones again. By mid-April, the situation in the house was dire. The Ammons even got into the habit of sleeping off the property, booking into a hotel to escape the horror on especially active nights. Eventually, increasingly concerned for her family's safety, LaToya reached out to their family physician for help. According to the details published in the Indianapolis Star's 2014 article on the haunting, he found the case bizarre. In his medical notes about his visit, he wrote of delusions of ghost in home and hallucinations. Even so, when speaking with the journalist who covered the story, he was clear to state that he himself was scared when he walked into the room. 20 years, and I've never heard anything like that in my life. And so it was that the involvement of the family's doctor opened the floodgates for other medical, psychiatric, and social care professionals to become involved in the increasingly creepy case. Indeed, by the time of the story's conclusion, nearly 800 pages of official records had been produced, largely by the Department of Child Services. Sensationally, it is in such government reports that an oft-quoted and highly sensational anecdote is recorded. The moment when medical staff supposedly observed LaToya's youngest son being lifted and thrown into the wall with nobody touching him. He passed out after that, being cradled by his mother and grandmother, unable to be roused until being relocated to the hospital. At the hospital, it is said that the paranormal drama escalated even further. The older boy, then aged 9, is said to have deteriorated, screaming and thrashing to such a degree that it took 5 men to hold him down. It was at this point that a Department of Child Services case manager was called to the scene. Her name was Valerie Washington, and one of the first things that she did when she arrived at the hospital was to interview LaToya Ammons. According to her report, she and a hospital psychiatrist assessed the mother as having a sound mind, and thus not responsible for encouraging or reinforcing her children's abnormal behavior. Additional hospital personnel also examined Ammons and her children physically, finding them to be healthy and free of marks or bruises. And yet, when Valerie Washington attempted to interview the youngest boy, it is said that his behavior entirely altered. No longer mild-mannered and compliant, he is alleged to have bared his teeth and growled at the caseworker. He then lunged for his older brother, locking his hands around his throat, refusing to let go until adults were able to pry his hands open. Washington and registered nurse Willie Lee Walker then brought the 2 boys into a small exam room in order to continue the interview. Grandmother Rosa Campbell joined them. Once more, the youngest boy is said to have begun to growl, after which he verbally threatened his older brother. Desperate to avoid a repeat of his earlier behavior, his grandmother is said to have grabbed his hands. Her attempts at restraining her grandson, however, were met with violence. In front of the caseworker and nurse, the 7-year-old boy started to repeatedly headbutt his grandmother in the stomach. When she prayed in an attempt to make him stop, his unnatural behavior intensified even further. According to Valerie Washington's original Department of Child Services report, the boy was suddenly possessed by a weird grin, after which he walked backwards up the wall to the ceiling. He then flipped over his grandmother and landed on his feet, not once letting go of her hand. Sensationally, Nurse Walker corroborated the strange account, later speaking with the press to describe what he had seen in the hospital room that day. He walked up the wall, flipped over her, and stood there, the nurse explained simply. There's no way he could have done that. When local police questioned the witnesses, they requested clarification, asking whether or not the boy had run up the wall so as to perform some manner of acrobatic feat. The caseworker's response was clear. No, the boy had glided backward on the floor, wall, and ceiling. Supposedly, both the caseworker and the nurse had raced from the room in fear after seeing the boy walk up the wall. As for him, he is said to have had no memory of the event, and was unable to replicate his actions when requested. The following day, the Department of Child Services separated LaToya Ammons from her 3 children. According to Valerie Washington's report, all of the children were experiencing spiritual and emotional distress, and as such, it was in their best interest for them to be removed, with the Department of Child Services even taking the emergency step of taking the children into custody without a court order. With her children now removed, Ammons was determined not merely to get them back, but to return their life to normality. And so it was at this point that Reverend Michael Maginot, a priest at St. Stephen Martyr Parish in Merrillville for more than 10 years, became involved. Invited to the Ammons family's home on Carolina Street, he first interviewed LaToya and Rosa so as to confirm the nature of their problem. During the interview, it is reported that he experienced some of the paranormal phenomena that had been plaguing the family, including the appearance of wet footprints in the living room. He also held a crucifix to LaToya's head, which resulted in her immediately quivering and convulsing. Convinced that the house and the family were indeed in the grip of something diabolical, he conducted prayers and blessed the property before leaving, advising LaToya and Rosa to do the same. The house was not safe, and the only option was for them to move out. And certainly in the following weeks, months, and even years, others who came to investigate the property are said to have drawn the same conclusions. Police officers are said to have experienced multiple electronic anomalies in the house, including the inexplicable malfunctioning of an audio recorder and the eerie capturing of an EVP that seemed to whisper "hey" to an officer from Lake County. In the official Lake County police report that was produced in the wake of the incident, a photographic anomaly is likewise described. A white cloud-like image is said to have appeared in not one but 2 photographs of the basement stairs. Within the anomaly was something resembling a female face. According to the report, several later attempts to explain these images were unsuccessful. It is interesting to note that much of the activity experienced by the Ammons family, including footsteps, bangs, and even the establishment of a ritual altar, took place in that basement. Even the captain of the Gary Police Department, Charles Austin, became involved in the case. In the course of his investigation, he was made a believer, with him even claiming that the activity followed him home after visiting the house. The driver's seat of his car moved forwards and backwards by itself, his garage door refused to open, and his police radio malfunctioned on the drive home. He is also said to have captured further photographic anomalies featuring strange spectral silhouettes. The most famous of the photos that resulted from police investigations is said to show yet another figure, this time in the window of the house, photographed from the outside, the property empty at the time. Meanwhile, the children remained under the guardianship of the Department for Child Services. The trio continued to complain of demonic possession, and whilst it was determined that they were not suffering from a true psychotic disorder, according to a report produced by clinical psychologist Stacey Wright, the youngest boy did exhibit worrying signs of delusion. This, so the medical professional wrote, appears to be an unfortunate and sad case of a child who has been induced into a delusional system, perpetuated by his mother. And yet, LaToya and others were convinced that all that they had seen, heard, and experienced were not delusions. They were demons. In this way, she and her mother Rosa remained in contact with Reverend Michael Maginot, ultimately arranging for him to perform an exorcism. In the 6-page report which he produced in order to get permission to do so from the bishop, Reverend Michael described all of the activity that he, the family, and police officers had experienced, including, most recently, nightly dreams of a vivid and explicitly violent nature suffered by LaToya as her alleged demonic possession got worse. On Wednesday, the 30th of May 2012, 6 months since the family had started experiencing activity at the house, permission to perform an exorcism was granted. It was the first exorcism that the bishop had ever authorized in his 21 years as head of the Diocese of Gary. According to a 2014 interview with the Reverend, it began without incident. It wasn't until he requested the demonic entity's name that LaToya started convulsing. Each time he condemned the demons, there was a reaction. 2 police officers are also said to have been present at the exorcism, attending Reverend Michael's church to oversee the rite and provide physical assistance if required. Ultimately, the Reverend performed 3 major exorcisms on LaToya in June 2012, the first 2 in English and the final in Latin. The 3rd time, she is said to have been delivered from evil. Describing it afterwards, the mother explained how painful the experience was and how, whilst different from a natural pain, it felt just as intense as giving birth. By November, her children were returned to her. She, they, and her mother moved elsewhere. The house with its 200 demons resigned to memory. And yet, the story did not end there. Indeed, the property became a source of local intrigue, with the police who had become involved in the Ammons case continuing to drive by and keep an eye on it. What they had seen and experienced there was, after all, difficult to forget. Then, in 2014, the story hit the press, with an international tug-of-war between skeptics and believers erupting over the case's genuineness. Skeptics like Joe Nickell branded the story sensationalized superstition, inflamed by the family's lust for notoriety and stubborn unwillingness to be reasoned with. In his report for the Skeptical Inquirer, he took aim at many involved, including the nurse at the hospital who, when he reached out, would not confirm his witness testimony. LaToya's landlord, the owner of the so-called demon house, Charles Reed, also voiced his skepticism in the press, describing how his tenant had taken him inside the house and showed him different stuff. He didn't see anything that was relevant and suggested it may have been a fabricated story. "I just figured she owed me money," he explained in a 2014 interview. "That's not strange to my walk of life. That does happen." Even so, Reed did concede that, given how multiple people, including police officers and priests, had reported witnessing activity, it was considerably more difficult to dismiss the entire incident as a hoax. It was hot on the heels of this media storm that one of the world's leading paranormal investigators, Zach Bagans, purchased the house, sight unseen, for $35,000. Reed was glad to be rid of the by now troublesome and infamous property, and Bagans was eager to put its claims of diabolical haunting to the test. After all, whilst LaToya had supposedly been delivered from demons via multiple exorcisms, it was whispered that the property, the very fabric of the building, remained in the grip of unseen malevolent forces. According to Bagans, the demon house and the documentary he made about it represents his most challenging and longest investigation to date, one which left him permanently scarred after his eyesight became damaged in the house. In the course of filming, he developed chronic double vision, with the ghost hunter to this day forced to wear special prism glasses to avoid risking total blindness. In addition to this, it is said that a whole host of other paranormal activity was documented, diabolical phenomena that was consistent with the Ammons family's earlier claims. Crew members were attacked, ritual items were uncovered in the basement, formless, black masses were seen to manifest. Whatever was there was not merely dark, but highly intelligent and powerful. In Bagans' own words, being in that particular environment created a nest for dark energy. With all that happened during the production of his documentary, there were enough findings to convince him that the house needed to be destroyed, for his own safety and the safety of others involved in the investigation, including the Ammons exorcist Reverend Michael Maginot, renowned psychic medium Chris Fleming, and seasoned researcher Dr. Barry Taff. And so, in 2016, Zach Bagans demolished the property, with remnants of the demon house subsequently moved to his haunted museum in Las Vegas for further investigation. Other fragments of the demon house were dispersed around the world for similar study and display, including to our very own Rowton's Museum of the Paranormal and Spirituality in Carmarthen, Wales. And so, for many, many people who have interacted with this case, whether that be as tenants, government caseworkers, police, priests, or paranormal investigators, the events that took place in Gary, Indiana were not merely very real, but had very real-world consequences also. People were hurt, families divided, with it now said by many that the Demon House story stands as proof of what can happen in the worst case scenario. What can happen when dark, demonic energy converges in one location and decides to target any and all who enter its domain. Thank you so much for watching. I very much hope you enjoyed this video. If you did and are new to my channel, you might like to explore some of my other videos, including the ones linked on screen now. Equally, I have more content for you to enjoy over on my second channel, Laura Rowton.